He chose a Tuesday evening to end our marriage. Not a weekend, not a moment heavy with occasion, a Tuesday like it was an item on his to-do list he had been meaning to get to. The dining room table was set the way I always set it, with the linen placemats and the good glasses, because I had made roasted chicken and hadn't known yet that the evening had a different agenda entirely. Warren sat across from me, cut his chicken twice, and then set his fork down with the particular deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed what came next. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said we had grown in different directions. He said he had met someone younger, he added, with the specific cruelty of someone who wanted that word to land. Someone lighter, someone who didn't carry the weight of the past the way I did. Then he reached beside his chair and placed a manila envelope on the table between us. Divorce papers already prepared, already organized, already assuming a particular outcome. He tapped the envelope once. He reminded me, with a patience that made my skin crawl, that the prenup we had signed 12 years ago protected his assets clearly and comprehensively. He said the settlement inside was fair. He said I should take some time, but not too much. Then he picked up his fork and continued eating. And I sat very still, feeling something I didn't immediately recognize as an advantage. The settlement offer was 4 pages long and written in the kind of language designed to sound generous, while being the opposite. Warren walked me through it the following morning at the same dining room table, using the tone he used in business meetings, measured, reasonable, faintly condescending in the way that people were condescending when they believed they held every card. He pointed out, more than once, that I hadn't held a full-time job in 11 years. That I had been, in his careful phrasing, supported by the marriage. That the prenup reflected the reality of who had built what and who had contributed what, financially speaking. The settlement offered me a lump sum that was, by any objective measure, inadequate for a woman who had spent over a decade managing a household, supporting a career, and quietly making possible the life that had apparently become too heavy for him. I listened to everything he said. I asked 2 clarifying questions about the timeline for response. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not pick up the pen he had placed beside the papers. Warren watched me with the slight confusion of someone who had prepared for a scene and found themselves in a different play entirely. He said he was glad I was being reasonable. I told him I needed a few days to review everything carefully. He nodded, satisfied. He had already decided I would sign. He was already wrong. I saw them 4 days later. I wasn't looking. I had driven to a part of the city I didn't usually frequent to pick up a book I had ordered from a small independent shop, and they were simply there, on the sidewalk outside a restaurant I had never been to. Her name was Tara. I had found that out through a mutual friend who had told me with the wincing sympathy of someone delivering news they wished they didn't have. She was younger than me by at least 15 years, dark-haired, bright-coated, the kind of effortlessly put together that took considerable effort. Her hand was on Warren's arm in the particular way of someone completely comfortable with where she was standing. They were laughing at something. Warren's head was tilted toward her with an attentiveness I recognized. I had been on the receiving end of it, once, a long time ago. I stood on the other side of the street and looked at them for exactly as long as it took me to understand something important. This had not started recently. The ease between them, the unconscious physical familiarity, that was not the body language of a new relationship. That was the body language of something that had been running quietly in the background for long enough to become comfortable. I drove home. I did not call Warren. I sat in the kitchen and thought about timing and about how much timing would matter in the weeks ahead. I moved into the guest room on a Saturday. Not because Warren asked me to, he hadn't, which was its own kind of statement, but because I needed space that was entirely mine while I thought. The guest room had a small desk by the window and a chair I had always liked and never used, and I made it into something functional. I brought my laptop, a legal pad, a box of files I had kept over the years out of the same organizational instinct that had made me good at managing the household. Warren noticed the move that evening. He stood in the guest room doorway for a moment, looking at the rearranged furniture and my things arranged on the desk. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine, just giving us both space while we worked through the process. He accepted this. More than accepted it, he seemed relieved. He had expected tears, arguments, the exhausting emotional labor of someone falling apart. My calm confused him in a way I could see him working to interpret. He settled on the explanation that suited him most. I had accepted it. I was adjusting. I was, as he had assumed from the beginning, not going to be a problem. He said goodnight with something almost like warmth and closed the door behind him. I turned back to my desk, opened the legal pad, and began writing down everything I remembered about the prenup, including the clause I had insisted on 12 years ago that he had signed without reading carefully. I had insisted on the clause myself. That was the part Warren had never understood because he had never asked why it was there, and I had never volunteered the explanation. It had been my family lawyer, my late father's attorney, a meticulous woman named Eleanor Voss who had been practicing family law for 30 years, who had suggested it during the prenup negotiations. Eleanor had looked at Warren's financial profile, at the structure of his business holdings, and at me, and she had said quietly that love was one thing and documentation was another, and that a woman entering a marriage with a man of significant means should have specific protections in the event of specific behaviors. The clause was not complicated. It stated, in clear and binding language, that in the event of documented infidelity occurring during the marriage, combined with any evidence of financial concealment or misuse of marital assets for personal benefit outside the marriage, the prenup's standard asset protection provisions would be suspended and replaced by an alternative division framework significantly more favorable to me. Warren had read the prenup the way busy, confident men read documents they assumed their lawyers had handled, quickly, with the assumption that everything was routine. He had signed it with a distracted smile at the closing table. He had never brought it up again. I had thought about it, quietly and occasionally, over 12 years. Now, sitting at the guest room desk in the dark, I opened the folder and found my copy. I turned to page 7. I read the clause twice. Then I closed the folder and went to sleep for the first time in days. His lawyer called on a Wednesday. Her name was Brenda Caulfield, and she had the efficient, slightly impatient manner of someone billing by the hour who preferred matters to resolve quickly. She said she was calling as a courtesy, a word that did not match her tone, to discuss the timeline for my response to the settlement offer. She said Warren was hoping to move forward efficiently. She used the word efficiently twice. She said that delays in these matters rarely benefited anyone, and that the current offer reflected a fair reading of the prenup's provisions, and that I should be aware the terms could become less favorable if I chose to contest unnecessarily. I wrote down 3 things during that call: the date, the time, and the phrase "less favorable if you contest." Then I thanked her professionally and said my attorney would be in touch. There was a pause on the line. "You've retained counsel?" she asked. The surprise in her voice was small but real. "I'm in the process," I said, which was true enough. After I hung up, I sat for a moment thinking about that pause. Warren had not told Brenda Caulfield to expect me to have a lawyer. He had told her, I suspected, that this would be straightforward, that I was not the type to fight, that the whole thing would be resolved quickly and cleanly. The urgency of her call confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that speed was important to him for reasons that went beyond convenience. The photos appeared online on a Friday evening, posted by someone in our wider social circle who clearly had no idea, or perhaps had every idea, what they were sharing. Warren and Tara at what appeared to be a charity gala, him in his good dark suit, her in something red and carefully chosen. They looked, in the photo, like a couple who had arrived together and intended to leave together. The caption didn't mention Warren by name, but enough people knew his face. By Saturday morning, for people had sent me the post in various forms, some with long messages of sympathy, some with shorter ones that carried the particular discomfort of people who didn't know which side of a situation to stand on. By Sunday, I had become, in the language of the comments and the whisper network of people who had known us as a couple, the wife he outgrew. That phrase arrived via a text from a woman I had considered a genuine friend, who sent it with a horrified disclaimer that she was only telling me so I would know what was being said. I read the phrase 3 times. Then I filed it away, mentally, alongside everything else I was collecting. Not because it hurt less than it did, but because hurt and strategy were 2 things I had decided to keep in separate rooms inside myself, and the strategy room was the one I needed to be in right now. I ran into Philip Crane at the dry cleaner on a Monday. Philip had been Warren's college roommate and had remained one of those peripheral friends who appeared at dinners and holiday parties and never quite became close to either of us individually. He was polite when he saw me, in the over-careful way of a man navigating uncertain social terrain. I asked him, as casually as I could manage, how long he had known about Tara. He went still for a moment. Then he said he didn't know what I meant. I looked at him steadily and said nothing. After a few seconds, he looked away. He said he had met her at a work event of Warren's, a phrase that placed the introduction in a professional context, which was not the same as telling me she was a colleague. Then he said, carefully, that he had seen them together at a few things over the past year or so. A year or so. Warren had told me the relationship was new, that it had developed after things between us had already deteriorated. A year or so was not new. A year or so was not something that developed after. A year or so was something that had been running alongside our marriage for a significant, specific, and legally relevant stretch of time. I thanked Philip genuinely, which seemed to make him more uncomfortable than anything else I could have said. Then I drove directly to make an appointment with an attorney. Her name was Nora Halstead, and she came recommended by Eleanor Voss's former associate, which was recommendation enough. She had an office on the 14th floor of a building downtown with a waiting room that was deliberately understated, the kind of space that communicated competence without performance. She was in her late 50s, with reading glasses on a chain and the specific stillness of someone who had heard a great many difficult stories and responded to all of them with the same level-headed attention. I brought the prenup. I brought Warren's settlement offer. I brought the legal pad where I had been keeping notes since the Tuesday he had placed the envelope on our dining room table. I told her everything in order, without editorializing. She listened, asked 4 questions, and made notes in small, precise handwriting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the prenup and turned to page 7. She read the clause. She read it again. Then she set the document down, looked at me over her glasses, and said something I had needed to hear from someone outside my own head. Did he really sign this? She said it with the quiet precision of a professional who had just seen something significant. Not dramatically. Not with any excess. Just the exact weight the moment required. I said yes. She nodded once. Then she said, "All right. Tell me everything you remember about the last 2 years." Nora's reaction to the clause was measured and thorough, which told me more than enthusiasm would have. She explained it carefully, walking through each condition the clause required to activate. Documented infidelity, meaning evidence of a relationship that had occurred during the marriage, not after separation. Financial concealment or misuse, meaning marital assets used for personal benefit outside the marriage, without disclosure. Both conditions together. She was clear that one without the other would not be sufficient. She was equally clear that if both conditions could be demonstrated, the clause would not merely adjust the settlement, it would effectively invert the prenup's protections entirely. The asset division framework it substituted was, in her professional assessment, substantially more favorable to me than anything Warren's current offer approached. She said we needed to establish a clear timeline, specifically when the relationship with Tara had actually begun, and we needed to review financial records from the relevant period. She asked how much access I had to household financial documents. I told her I had managed the household accounts for 11 years and still had full access to the joint accounts, the shared credit cards, and the filing system I had maintained throughout the marriage. Nora wrote something down. Then she looked up and said, with the calm of someone stating a fact rather than offering encouragement, "You came in more prepared than most people do." I told her I had been thinking carefully for 2 weeks. She nodded. Then let's start looking. The clause required 2 things to activate, and Nora was careful to explain both without overpromising either. The first condition was documented infidelity during the marriage, not suspected, not implied, but supported by evidence that established the relationship had existed while Warren and I were still legally married and not separated. The second condition was financial concealment, specifically the use of marital assets for the benefit of the other relationship in a way that had not been disclosed. Nora said that prenup clauses of this type were not unusual in high-asset marriages, but that they were frequently unenforceable because the evidence required was difficult to obtain after the fact. What made our situation different, potentially different, she was careful to say, was that I had maintained the household financial records throughout the marriage. If Warren had used joint accounts or shared credit cards in ways that connected to Tara during the period the relationship had been active, those records would be part of the documentation I already had legal access to. I asked her what we were looking for, specifically. She described it plainly. Travel charges, hotel bookings, restaurant bills, gift purchases, anything that could be dated and placed in a timeline alongside evidence of the relationship. She said we would start with the past 18 months and work backward from there. I went home that evening and pulled out every credit card statement I had filed for the past 2 years. I spread them across the guest room desk and started reading from the beginning. The pattern emerged in the third month of statements I reviewed. Not dramatically, not a single obvious charge that announced itself, but as the accumulation of small, consistent things that only made sense when you arranged them in order. Hotel charges in cities where Warren had claimed to travel alone for business. Restaurant bills in the city, on evenings he had said he was working late, at places I had never been to and that didn't appear in any context connected to his professional network. A florist charge in February, which was not my birthday, not our anniversary, not any occasion I could locate in the calendar of our shared life. I made a separate list, organized by date, and cross-referenced each charge against Warren's stated schedule during the same periods. The overlaps were consistent enough that Nora, when I brought her the organized records, spent 20 minutes reviewing them in silence before she said anything at all. What she said was this: "This is the beginning of the financial picture. Now, we need to tie the timeline." She explained that the credit card records established financial activity. What we needed alongside them was evidence placing Tara specifically in those locations or occasions, something that connected her presence to the expenditure. She asked if there was any digital record, any communication, anything that could serve as corroboration. I thought about something Philip Crane had said. A work event. Over a year ago. And I knew where to start looking. Warren had always been comfortable with success. That was something I had admired early in our marriage and had learned to simply observe in the years that followed. He wore it well. The good apartment he had moved into within 2 weeks of leaving our house. The upgrades to his wardrobe I heard about through the same network of peripheral friends who had been sending me social media posts. He had taken Tara to a restaurant that required reservations months in advance and had been photographed there by someone whose account had a few thousand followers. He had upgraded his car. He sent flowers to his new address, which I knew because the charge appeared on a card he had apparently forgotten was still connected to our joint account, an oversight he would realize only later. Each of these things taken alone was just the behavior of a man moving on. Together, they were the behavior of a man who believed the outcome of the divorce was already settled in his favor. That confidence was, in a legal sense, a problem for him, because a man who believed he had already won stopped being careful. He stopped checking what was connected to what. He stopped monitoring the small administrative details that had always been my domain and that I had continued, quietly, to have access to. He had moved on before the divorce was finalized. He had started spending before the accounts were separated. And I had kept every statement. The credit card statement that mattered most was from 14 months before Warren had told me the relationship with Tara was new. It showed a charge at a hotel in Charleston, a city Warren had visited for what he had described as a 2-day industry conference. The hotel was not the conference hotel, which I confirmed with a single search. It was a boutique property across the city, the kind chosen for atmosphere rather than proximity. The charge was for 2 nights. The amount reflected a room rate consistent with the hotel's listed pricing for their premium accommodations. I cross-referenced the dates with Warren's calendar, which I had maintained for years and still had archived. He had been in Charleston for 3 days. He had told me the conference was 2 days. 1 extra day, at a hotel he had no professional reason to be at, 14 months before he claimed the relationship had begun. I brought the statement to Nora. She looked at it for a long time. Then she asked if I had any way to corroborate that Tara had been in Charleston during the same period. I did not have direct evidence. But I had something adjacent, a A social media post Tara had made, which a friend had screenshotted and sent me weeks earlier without realizing its relevance, showing her at what appeared to be a coastal location, tagged without a city, but with a timestamp that placed it within the same 3-day window. It was not proof on its own, but it was the beginning of a trail that, alongside the financial records, was starting to tell a very specific story. Brenda Caulfield called again on a Thursday, and this time her tone had lost the veneer of courtesy entirely. She said Warren's team had become aware that I had retained counsel and that the current offer had a response deadline that I was approaching. She said that if I chose to contest the prenup's provisions, the process would become lengthy and expensive, and that I should be realistic about my position. She used the phrase "realistic about your position" twice, with the emphasis of someone who believed they were describing a weakness. I had been thinking about that phrase since the first call, about what it meant to be realistic about a position, and how that assessment changed entirely depending on which information you had access to. I told Brenda Caulfield that my attorney would be reaching out directly to discuss the timeline. She said she hoped we could resolve this efficiently. I said I was sure we could. After I hung up, I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand, thinking about efficiency and what it meant to each party in this conversation. Warren wanted efficiency because he was confident. His confidence was built on an incomplete reading of the prenup and an incomplete understanding of what I had spent the past weeks assembling. The urgency of Brenda Caulfield's calls was not pressure. It was, if I read it correctly, the sound of a legal strategy that needed to close before something changed. I had no intention of letting it close before I was ready. The business expense records took Nora's financial specialist 2 weeks to review. Her name was Diane Okafor, and she was methodical in the way that people were methodical when they had spent careers finding things that other people had assumed were hidden. She reviewed Warren's business account records, to which I had access as a named party in several of the associated entities from our marriage, alongside the personal credit card statements I had provided. What she found, once she had organized everything chronologically, was a pattern of business expenses that did not align with any verifiable business purpose. Travel charges billed to his company account for trips that corresponded with the personal hotel charges I had already identified. Client entertainment expenses at restaurants on evenings when no client meeting appeared in any calendar or communication record I could locate. A category of charges labeled strategic development that, when cross-referenced with dates and locations, overlapped consistently with the timeline of the relationship. Diane presented her findings to Nora in a document that was 23 pages long and organized by date, category, and cross-reference. Nora read it, made notes in the margin, and then looked at me over her glasses. "This isn't just emotional betrayal," she said. "He used company money with marital asset implications, to fund a relationship he was conducting during your marriage." She paused. "That is the second condition of your clause." Nora said it plainly, the way she said most things. She leaned back in her chair on a Friday afternoon, with Diane's report and my credit card records spread across the conference table between us, and she said, "This changes everything." Not with drama. Not with the inflection of someone delivering a speech. Just as a factual assessment of where we now stood relative to where we had started. I had come into her office 6 weeks earlier with a prenup, a legal pad, and the specific instinct that something about Warren's confidence had been premature. Now we had a documented timeline showing the relationship had begun at least 14 months before Warren claimed. We had financial records connecting marital and business assets to expenses incurred during that period for the benefit of the relationship. We had the clause signed and dated that tied those two conditions to a specific and binding legal consequence. Nora explained what the next steps looked like. We would not be responding to the current settlement offer. We would be presenting a counterposition that invoked the clause directly, backed by the documentation we had assembled. Warren's team would have the option to dispute the evidence, which would require them to explain the financial records in a different way than we were explaining them, a task Nora described, with quiet precision, as challenging given the consistency of the pattern. I drove home that evening feeling something I had not felt since the Tuesday he had set the envelope on our dining room table. I felt entirely steady. Warren called me directly on a Sunday evening, not through Brenda Caulfield, not through the formal channels we had established, but on my cell phone, the way he used to call when something needed to be handled. His voice had a different quality than it had carried in our dining room conversation. Less managed. The performance of reasonableness had developed a small crack in it. He said he had heard I was making things complicated. He said he thought we had both agreed this could be handled simply. He said he was willing to revise the offer. He named a number higher than the original, said it with the confidence of someone expecting it to resolve the situation. I asked if the revision would be coming through his attorney. He said yes, of course. I said I would have Nora review it. He paused. Then he said he just wanted us to be able to get through this without it becoming ugly. I said I wanted that too, which was true. He seemed to take this as agreement. His voice relaxed slightly. He said he appreciated my maturity about the whole thing. I said goodnight and ended the call. Then I sat in the guest room and thought about that word, maturity, and how he had used it the same way he had used reasonable and fair and efficient, as a synonym for compliance. For a moment, looking at the revised offer Nora received 2 days later, I almost felt something like sympathy for how wrong he was about to discover he had been. The message chain came from an unlikely source. Warren had used a personal email account for communications he considered private, an account I had no access to and had never sought. But Tara, it turned out, had used her own phone to take a photo at the Charleston Hotel and had sent it to a friend with a caption that placed her there clearly. That friend had posted it to a private account. That private account had been visible, at the time, to someone who had since changed her privacy settings and screenshotted the post during a period when she was still connected to both our social circles. That screenshot had made its way, through 2 degrees of connection, to someone who passed it to Nora's office with a note saying she thought it might be relevant. It was time-stamped. It showed Tara at a location that matched the hotel where Warren had charged 2 nights, 14 months before the stated beginning of the relationship. It was not, on its own, a confession, but placed alongside the financial records, the cross-reference dates, and Philip Crane's casual mention of having met her at events. Over the past year or so, it extended the documented timeline further back than we had previously been able to reach. Nora added it to the file. She told me that the timeline was now coherent, consistent, and supported by multiple independent sources that had not been coordinated with each other. He's been in this relationship for longer than he told you, she said. And we can show it. Nora explained the clause's full activation with the care of someone who wanted me to understand exactly what I was holding. She spread the relevant documents across the conference table in a specific order: the prenup, the financial summary, the timeline, the corroborating evidence, and walked through each element and how it connected to the clause's language. The clause required 2 conditions, both documented. The first, infidelity occurring during the marriage, defined as a romantic or intimate relationship conducted with a party other than the spouse while the marriage was legally intact and no formal separation had been filed. The second, financial concealment, defined as the use of marital assets or business assets with marital implications for the direct or indirect benefit of the other party to the infidelity, without disclosure to the spouse. Both conditions were met. The timeline established the relationship had been ongoing during the marriage, not after deterioration, not after separation, but during. The financial records established that marital and business assets had funded that relationship in ways that had not been disclosed. The clause stated clearly that under these conditions, the prenup standard protections were suspended and the alternative division framework applied. That framework gave me a substantially larger share of the marital assets than Warren's original offer had suggested was even negotiable. Nora folded her hands on top of the stack of documents. He doesn't have the protection he thought he had, she said. In fact, the prenup now works against him. Warren filed formally on a Wednesday. Brenda Caulfield submitted the paperwork through the court with the efficiency of a legal team that believed they were managing a predictable process toward a predetermined conclusion. Nora had anticipated this and told me it was, in a specific way, useful. Once Warren filed formally, the prenup's provisions became part of the official legal record, which meant the clause became part of the official legal record, which meant that any invocation of the clause, any presentation of the evidence we had assembled, would occur within a formal legal process where documentation carried full evidentiary weight, where records could not be dismissed as personal grievance, and where the consistent, cross-reference timeline we had built would be evaluated by people whose entire job was to assess whether evidence said what it appeared to say. Nora said Warren's legal team had made a strategic error, a common one, she added, among parties who were confident. They had moved to formalize the process before fully understanding what the opposing position actually was. They knew I had a lawyer. They did not yet know what that lawyer had. The formal filing locked Warren into a legal framework where the clause could now be enforced through the court, not just negotiated around a conference table. He had filed thinking the process was already won. What he had actually done was open the room where the rest of the story would be told. The settlement meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning at a neutral location, a conference room in a downtown mediation center, the kind of place with water pitchers on the table and no windows facing the street. Warren arrived with Brenda Caulfield and a second attorney I hadn't seen before, which told me they had brought reinforcement. He was dressed well. His posture carried the particular ease of a man who had walked into many rooms expecting to leave with what he came for. He nodded at me when he came in, a civil nod, the kind exchanged between people managing a transaction. Nora and I were already seated. Nora had a single file folder in front of her, closed. Nothing spread on the table, nothing displayed. Warren's team had a considerable amount of paper arranged in front of them. I had noticed over the past weeks that the volume of paper people brought to these settings was often inversely related to how clearly their position held up. Nora had taught me that lesson without stating it directly. Brenda Caulfield opened by restating the terms of Warren's revised offer, framing it as a final and reasonable position. Nora listened without interrupting. When Brenda finished, Nora thanked her. Then she opened her folder, removed a single clean document, and placed it in the center of the table. "Before we discuss the offer," she said, in the same unhurried tone she used for everything, "there's something the prenup requires us to address first." Nora presented the timeline first. She walked through each date methodically, cross-referencing the financial records as she went. The Charleston hotel charge, the corresponding dates, the business expenses tied to the same windows of time, the florist charge in February, the restaurant bills on evenings with no verifiable professional context. She spoke plainly, without accusation, without emotional framing, just the dates and the amounts and what they corresponded to. Then she placed the corroborating evidence alongside the financial records. Philip Crane's account, provided as a written statement. The time-stamped photograph from Charleston. The social media post, and its date. Each piece presented without commentary beyond its relevance to the timeline. Then she turned to the prenup and read the clause aloud. Calmly. In full. The room was quiet in a specific way, not the quiet of people thinking but the quiet of people adjusting to something. Brenda Caulfield made a note. The second attorney leaned forward slightly. Warren's posture, which had carried the settled confidence of the past weeks, shifted in a way that was small and immediate. Not collapse. Warren was not the kind of man who collapsed visibly, but a change. The particular adjustment of someone whose internal calculation has just encountered information that doesn't fit it. He looked at the prenup page Nora had slid toward the center of the table. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Brenda Caulfield. And she had nothing immediately to say. The formal response from Warren's legal team came 8 days after the settlement meeting. It was longer than their previous communications and considerably more careful in its language. The difference between a letter written by people who were confident and a letter written by people who were now managing uncertainty. They did not concede the clause's applicability directly. What they did was request additional time to review the documentation presented and propose a revised framework for discussion. The revised framework, when Nora translated it into plain terms, represented a significant retreat from Warren's original position. The lump sum he had offered initially had more than doubled. The asset division he had presented as fixed and final was now described as open to further consideration. These were not the movements of a legal team that believed their position would hold under scrutiny. Nora submitted our formal response, which declined the revised offer and restated our position under the clause. Warren's attorney filed a procedural objection to the clause's interpretation. Standard practice, Nora said. when a party was buying time to reassess. Within 3 weeks, the objection had been reviewed and the clause's enforceability confirmed by a preliminary ruling. Warren's new apartment was quiet, I was told by someone who saw him around that time. He looked, the person said, like a man who had been carrying a certainty and had recently set it down somewhere and couldn't find it anymore. 6 months later, I live in a house that is smaller than the one I left and entirely my own. It has a front porch I sit on in the evenings, a kitchen I have arranged the way I prefer, and a guest room that I have converted into an office where I am, slowly and with genuine interest, taking on consulting work in the household financial management space. The skills I spent 11 years developing, now applied with my name attached to them. The settlement, finalized after 3 months of legal process, reflected the clause's alternative framework. Warren did not walk away with what he had assumed. The prenup he had signed with a distracted smile 12 years ago had protected him comprehensively, until it didn't. Until the specific conditions he had thought were theoretical turned out to be documented and provable and tied to a legal mechanism he had never taken seriously enough to read. He didn't lose everything. That was never the point. What he lost was the narrative. The version of events where he left cleanly and walked away with most of what we had built, and I accepted a settlement that reflected how little he thought I was worth. That version did not survive contact with a clause he had forgotten, records I had kept, and a lawyer who read everything carefully. I think about Eleanor Voss sometimes, her steady, practical voice across a conference table 12 years ago, suggesting that documentation was its own form of protection. She was right. I won because I was never as powerless as he believed. I won because he signed something he didn't read. And I won because I had spent 12 years quietly being the person who paid attention to the details, and it turned out in the end that the details were everything.